Hello, AP. So this is a two-parter. We're going to have some questions to go with this, and then there'll be a second ed puzzle on, as you can see, the Counter-Reformation. But first, the Tudors. They're so fun to talk about. So here we go, the Tudors. So basically, England was a hotbed for what was coming for the Reformation, because you already had people like Wycliffe and the Lollards who had already been influenced by those humanistic ideas of individual choice and individuality. And because of the distance, that's the best part. For Rome is a ways away from England. And so, therefore, England could become this breeding ground of Protestant concepts. So, before even you had Luther, you had the Lollards who were already pushing a concept of faith alone. And that had died down because of pushback by the Catholic Church and pressure put on the crown. But the English monarchs in England itself are a distance away from Rome, and that then allows them to kind of foster their own ideas. So um, this is Arthur. Let's go back one. Here it is. This is Arthur. So what happened? And you have to understand the pretext of what's happening here. Is as we've discussed in the trial thing we had, is that you had the War of the Roses between the Lancasters and the Yorks over the control of the throne. Out of that rose the Tudors because both families were deposed, that the heads of the houses died. And then, so Henry Tudor then claimed the throne as an usurper, which means that he does not have the same authority. He isn't in line for the throne, but he's kind of skipped a few people here. And so he's on a throne that truly isn't really his, or at least how they feel. We talked about how then he controlled the nobles by using the Star Chamber. He creates this apparatus that allows him then to control the nobles through threat of taking land and property and their lives by sending them to the tower. Well, as we move forward to his heirs, we come to Arthur. Arthur's a sickly child, and he marries this young woman who is Catherine of Aragon. She is the daughter of Isabel and Ferdinand. So this is going to link, let's go back. This is going to link England and Spain together. Well, he dies, leaving the marriage unconsummated. And so the heir then, Henry the Eighth, right here, he then marries Catherine to maintain that alliance, and he does find her quite intriguing. And since the marriage wasn't consummated, it is legal under the Catholic Church to marry your brother's wife. Typically, that is not allowed, but since it wasn't consummated, and because the Catholic Church needs an ally against France who's been exerting power on it, England and Spain being tied together with the Holy Roman Empire basically fortifies Europe as a Catholic stronghold and holds back powers that would usurp them, such as Francis in France. So this is Catherine. Oop. So so originally the Pope is all for Henry. And Henry is totally against Luther. He actually writes a pamphlet denouncing Luther and his Protestantism. And because of that, Henry is given the title Protector of the Faith. Henry's first daughter, though, does not, or first wife doesn't provide him with a daughter. Catherine of Aragon gives him a daughter who is going to be Mary Tudor, Mary the First, also known as Bloody Mary, which we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, that leaves an opening. She's older than him. He he grows less and less attracted to her. He also has an accident during this time when he's courting Anne Boleyn. While jousting, he falls off his horse and is given a severe leg wound, which then becomes a problem later. And there are theories and some historians who believe he was gay. He gave himself a concussion, which then may have affected his personality. But he grows weary of Catherine, and this is why Anne becomes intriguing. Anne had been in the French court, which gave her all kinds of intrigue in itself because, they said a lot about those French girls during this time. And she also knew how to manipulate him. She's a woman who knows how to use her feminine charms to control and manipulate men, namely Henry. And so she uses that to control the king. And then along the way, they do end up sleeping together, and she's with child. Henry, looking at the possibility of having an heir through her, decides it's time to do something about Catherine. And to do this, he's going to basically push her out, push Catherine out. Well, Catherine's not going to go quietly. Plus, the fact that her nephew is the king of Spain does not make this any easier for Henry. So he calls in the Vatican and would do exactly what we did in class. And out of that, the Pope is caught between a rock and a hard place, is that he wants to hold on to England, but he also is fearful of a very powerful and economically powerful Spain. And so they will not side with a divorce. So Henry decides that he's going to do something about this. He is going to make himself head of the faith and give himself a divorce. There is Henry at the time. This is Henry later, towards the end of his life. And so Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, there's an annulment. He then through, and this is where it becomes important. Two reasons. One, Anne is a Protestant. Secretly, she's a Protestant. And her family is then going to become prominent and going to use their power that they get through being the Queen's family to start moving England politically and religiously more and more towards Protestantism. To do all this, though, Henry doesn't want to change religion. Henry simply wants to create a political change. He wants to make himself head of the church, give himself a new religious power, and it will also increase his wealth because huge tracts of land in England belong to the Catholic Church. So if he makes himself head of the Catholic Church and he takes away church land, he then can increase his wealth and use that land then to buy favor with nobles. Henry also, by doing this, gives himself more political power in the urban areas where there's more merchants and individuals that are humanistic. Whereas in the countryside, it's going to see a pushback. So now the thing is, what we said, this is a political change. He is going to do all this, and this is why we can count it as a political change. One, he doesn't change church doctrine. If you went to a Catholic church the day after he does all this, the only thing that's different is they're not talking about the Pope. They talk about the king. The services, the doctrine, everything are exactly the same, except for the fact that you took out the Pope. Okay. The other reason why this is important, well, there's a couple reasons. Another reason why it's important is that Anne is going to start seeing the seeding of a Protestant concept is going to start coming in because you've weakened the Catholic Church and now Protestantism is going to start leaking into England. The one that's really important, though, is how he does this. Henry is going to go to Parliament, and he's going to have the Commons then and the House of Lords pass what they call the Act of Supremacy, which makes him the head of the church. Later, they're going to pass an Act of Succession, which recognizes Anne's children as heirs to the throne. By doing this, he's giving power to Parliament, something that had only been called for taxes and for rare laws. Henry then is to cover himself by saying, look, the people want this. Parliament wants this. He's going to Parliament, and then Parliament's like, okay, what do you do for us? And so slowly, and for the next monarchs, you're going to see, especially when you start with Henry and then you go to Elizabeth, because she's a woman and she needs Parliament as kind of cover, you're going to see this increase of power given to Parliament, which of course then is going to lead to the English Civil War and eventually to the English Bill of Rights after the Glorious Revolution, which then leads to the American Revolution. You're actually not rebelling against the King of England. You're rebelling against Parliament because of what Henry VIII put into power, put into place. So this is a political reformation, which then is going to become a religious one. Well, Catherine gets sent to a nunnery. He was going to get what he wanted. Catherine gets into a nunnery. Anne is married to Henry then. She gives birth to Elizabeth, but then she runs amiss of Henry. He grows tired of her. There's also some things she does in court that makes him irritated at her. And so he decides that it's time to get rid of her. Now, she does do some things that might have got herself into a bit of trouble, like possibly try to seduce her brother, because she's trying to keep the whole affair quiet so that she can have a child. Henry also has some issues in the bedroom at this point. And so um, she ends up being framed for uh, incest and adultery. Her brother is executed as part of the plot. She is beheaded. Henry doesn't even provide a coffin for her, but he does allow the family to get a French swordsman who cuts her head off while in mid prayer. He calls her name, and when Anne turns, he takes her head off with one blow. Since Henry didn't provide a coffin, she's buried in an arrow box, which is like an ammo box. She's buried in. They tuck her head in. That's why the ghosts in the tower are typically headless, wearing this necklace you see here, this jeweled bee that was a gift of her family. Oh, so Anne is killed. Henry now has two children, Mary and Elizabeth. Mary is a devout Catholic through her mother. Elizabeth, well, Elizabeth's a little bit different. She is a politique. She sees through her mother how religion may have caused some problems, and so decides that she's going to use religion as a tool. Narrowing down what Elizabeth is, whether she is Catholic or Protestant, is a little hard to do. Henry then falls for his next wife, Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour does give him what he wanted, is she gives him a son. He has an heir now, but she dies soon after childbirth. To maintain the empire, then, there's an agreement that they will get him a new bride. Henry, an arranged marriage through his advisor, Thomas Cromwell, makes an arranged marriage with a German Protestant state because he needs allies now against Catholic states like France and Spain. So he then gets an arranged marriage with a woman named Anne of Cleves. It was sight unseen, kind of like an arranged marriage, um, and he gets catfished. She is not very attractive. She smells a bit unusual. He ends up growing accustomed to her, lead her, and becomes more like a daughter relationship because she's significantly younger than him. But it is not what he was looking for. The painter that went to go paint her painted the painting. He had choice: do I paint her as she actually looks, or how the king may want her to look? And if I paint how she actually looks, I could get executed. And if I paint her like he wants her to, I could get executed. So he basically paints Henry a painting that does not look like her, and then takes it to England, and then gets paid and leaves and never comes back to England. Henry annuls that marriage and sends her to an estate far away from him. He then marries a very beautiful young woman named Catherine Howard, who by this point, Henry is about 300 pounds, and has a festering leg wound that smells and is pretty much impotent. And she ends up falling, well, she never fell out of love with her childhood lover, Thomas Culpeper, who is then executed through the traitor's death because she gets found out. Catherine Howard is executed as well. Yeah, don't cheat on Henry VIII. And then that leads him to marrying his very last of his wives. So, boop, boop. So there's his children. He has a daughter who died, son who died, son who died, son who died. Mary, that's Mary the First, daughter who died. Elizabeth, who survived, son who died, unknown. They don't know. It was an illegitimate birth. So they don't know what the child was. Son who died, and of course Edward. So, and there's her Anne. Anne is executed at the Tower of London. That's the Tower of London. So why is this important? There are several key policies. One, obviously, the Act of Supremacy, which is what created him as the head of church and state. Okay, so in 1534, that's how he's going to become king of England, or not king of England, and the head of the church. Again, through Parliament, Act of Secession, oath of loyalty to king, and it basically establishes that the king's descendants, whether from Mary or from Anne, are going to be heirs to the throne. So that's very important. Okay. So this is this idea that you're to see Parliament being used and manipulated to control the religion. But that's important because they're going to Parliament. And that's what's going to set up what's coming later with the English Civil War, when the kings are abusing Parliament, and Parliament is like, hey, look, we had a say in all these things before, and now you are going against that. That's going to inspire Parliament to have this English Civil War. And that introduction of Protestantism, you're going to see an influx of Puritans, which of course will then cause a religious strife also. The Pilgrims of Grace in 1536 shows that not everyone is okay with this. That the northern areas and rural areas tended to be more religious Catholic and to be farther away from royal power. And so those rural areas that were farther away from London, they start pushing back. There's going to be an armed rebellion against the king, and they're going to march down basically as a sign of protest against the monarchy. Now, eventually it's going to be quashed, and the king is going to pardon them, though, but he pardons the peasants, not the nobles. And you're going to see again that many of the people being executed are, well, you'll see in the documents we do for this. But it shows that the king's real power is in the southern parts and then the rural areas. And you're going to see the same thing in the English Civil War. You're going to see the six articles are going to see a push towards religious reform. Under Edward, though, his son, Edward VI, you're going to see a huge increase in Protestantism, which then, when he dies, Mary comes in and starts pushing back Catholicism. And then Elizabeth comes in and starts pushing, well, kind of both, if that makes sense. So this is Mary. This is his very Catholic daughter. This is Elizabeth, who is kind of her own daughter, if that makes sense. Um, so Parliament, you're going to see that is, like we said, is going to see this passing of laws, this control and of Parliament, but the use of Parliament to do these things establishes this new concept that Parliament is a real power to be used. This is Thomas Cromwell we talked about, who's this Puritan Cranmer, who's going to be the new more or not sorry, Thomas Cromwell is not a Puritan. Thomas Cromwell is the one that gives him Anne of Cleves, but he is a Protestant. So we're going to see an influx, and then Cranmer, who is a Protestant as well, you're going to see some influx of Protestant concepts. Thomas More, who was a devout Catholic and Lord Chancellor, he's going to be executed because he will not side with Henry's act of secession against the Catholic Church. Henry, when he died, his 10-year-old son is going to come to the power, Edward VI. He will be ruled under regency by his uncle for a period of time. But this, his family that is overseeing him as a regent is extremely Protestant, and so he's influenced by Protestantism. So a lot of reforms are going to come through the Catholic, through the what was the Anglican Church established by Henry, starts moving farther and farther away from Catholicism. Edward's going to die, and of course that because he's not very well, he's very ill. His half sister Mary will come in and then reverse many of those reforms under hers and revert the country back to Catholicism. So this is Edward when he comes to power. There is an attempt to have him marry was Lady Jane Grey. Sorry for being garbled. Her name is Lady Jane Grey. They try to marry her to him as a Protestant to maintain Protestant rule. She only rules for like 9 days before she's captured and executed. Now, why is she called Bloody Mary? Because there is a pushback to destroy Protestant leaders and Protestants in the country, and they do execute large numbers of them. But so will Elizabeth when she comes in to Catholics, or Edward did to Catholics. So the reason why she gets the kind of moniker of Bloody Mary is because she's the loser in the story. She tries to turn the country back to Catholicism because she's married to the Spanish king, Philip II. And so she's very devoutly Catholic, and she tries to turn the country back to Catholicism. But in the process of trying to do that, she ends up becoming the enemy in the story, and hence history then paints her as the bad guy, as Bloody Mary. So this is her marriage to Philip II, which, by the way, when her death takes place, this is one of the things that triggers the attempt for Spain to invade England. Elizabeth, well, she's the middle road. Like we said, she's what they call a politique, and that's a term you need to know. A politique is an individual that religion is a secondary concept, that we're not overly worried about this. So when you look at her movements, right, like in 1559, the second Book of Common Prayers seems to be a Protestant movement, but yet many of her concepts also, when she does reforms or when she puts in laws, seem very Catholic. So she she's kind of being vague on what she is, except for obviously Puritans. She doesn't want anything to do with the Puritans. That's that whole mixing religion and your government thing. She does not want that. For political stability, she doesn't pick a side. Like the Catholics think she's on their side, Protestant think that she's on their side, and when actuality she's running right down the middle as this politique, so that she can maintain political stability and use both sides then as a political tool to defend her country and maintain civil order. She doesn't want rebellions like her father had with the Pilgrimage of Grace. This is maintaining a stable concept, doing what has to be done religiously and politically to get it done. It's very Machiavellian. So, all right. So, this is where we're going to end this one. And we basically, why is this all important? Again, Parliament. Parliament is becoming the tool that monarchs in England have to use. That when Henry opens the door a little bit, even though he doesn't change the religion except moving the Pope out, it opened the door for Protestantism and eventually Puritans. And those two things combined, Parliament getting a nod through the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Secession, and then the Six Acts, and then the 39, all these things she's done, the Common Prayer Book, all these things that his daughter and him will do open the door for Parliament's power. And then when a king later, Charles I and James I, deny Parliament that power, it's going to trigger the English Civil War. When a later heir, James II, does the same thing, it's going to cause the Glorious Revolution and eventually the English Bill of Rights, which will, because you're ignoring the English Bill of Rights by Parliament, not the king this time, it will trigger the American Revolution. That Enlightenment thing, folks. The other part of it is that when that you're opening that door for other religions, that allows in the Puritans, which then is another one of the triggers for the English Civil War. So that's where this is headed. That Henry Tudor, back in the War of the Roses, needed an heir to stabilize his throne. That concept that the throne could be lost triggers Henry VIII's desperation and his whole annulment and marrying of Anne and pushing Catherine aside, which then drove him to Parliament and away from the Catholic Church, creating the Anglican Church, increasing the king's power, but at the same time increasing the Parliament's power, and at the same time giving the king vast amounts of land to create an army and other powers. And that set up where we're going: an English Civil War, a glorious revolution, a Bill of Rights, and eventually an economic powerhouse in the form of England, and a revolution that's going to create America. All right, so this is where we're going to stop, and then we'll do the Catholic Reformation.